thank you, Katie, for inviting me to speak here. I'm really excited to share my research, and it's just a pleasure to be here today to speak to all of you. I just want to apologize in advance because, as you can probably imagine, a topic which ends up looking at constructions of race in the 18th and 19th century, and it's ended up being, you know, huge, and this is going to be kind of a whistle-stop tour for the next 20 minutes. So if you have any questions or anything you'd like me to expand on that you think I sort of glossed over, please do just let me know at the end. My interest in how Black Africans are represented in Greco-Roman galleries actually stirred up when I was undertaking my master's. I distinctly remember being in the lecture theatre when, and I might be flattering myself here, but the lecturer brought up a slide showing a Fayum mummy portrait that looked shockingly like me. And there she was there. So that was a very spooky moment in the lecture theatre, you know, glasses aside. It was also a really interesting moment for me for a couple of reasons, because firstly, it made me realize I'd never really seen a visual representation of someone who looked potentially mixed race, potentially like they might have Black African heritage in my academic studies before. And secondly, that didn't really make a great deal of sense because I knew logically that people of Black African descent, as well as North African descent and all the various overlaps existed within the Greco-Roman world. This is well documented, we know this. I just couldn't recall having ever seen any. So I went looking. And the results ranged over a wide variety of pieces. Here we've got a head vase, we've got an alabastron, a statue there from a variety of different museums as well, which is really nice. And then we've got a broken piece of a rhyton, which would be in a drinking vessel, and then a statue here, a pair of statues here of some boxes. And these are just a few examples from my database, which is in a constant stage of expansion as I move from museum to museum, mining their catalogues for examples. So it turns out Black Africans feature in most collections of antiquities, for all they might not be the first artworks you imagine when asked to think of the art of antiquity today, which usually ends up conjuring imagery that looks a bit more like this. So we've got the Prima Porta Augustus there, the Venus de Milo, arguably one of the most famous statues from the classical antiquity, the Laocoon group, and this siren vase here. So the obvious question here to me is why? Why does invoking the classical world still conjure imagery of both racialized and artistic whiteness, even though that's not necessarily how it, well, that's not how it was in the past. And when did this phenomenon begin? Unfortunately, this is not something I can answer with all the detail and nuance it requires in 25 minutes. However, what I can do is introduce the key themes and ideas underpinning my research, which I hope will demonstrate why it's important to look to the beginnings of collecting culture to better understand how we understand the classical world today. I aim to show the socio-political context within which the 18th and 19th century antiquarians were collecting, particularly in Britain, highlight where ideas of race, foreignness, and national identity fit into all of this, and then share a few of the interesting sort of problem pieces that gathering my data has presented me with so far. And then I'm going to end by just going back to that original question of why and seeing how we feel about that. So we'll start as where I so often end up starting these days with, which is with the Enlightenment. And in order to really understand how early collections of antiquities were being collected and displayed, I had to take a step back from the collections themselves and really look at what was going on in Europe at the time. There's been a really important step in understanding the wider context of the collection of these pieces and highlights their place in the development of aesthetic and moral ideas in the 18th and 19th centuries. So our starting point, the Enlightenment, here's just an image of what was going on at the time. It's important, this period is important to my research for several reasons. However, for the purposes of this talk, I've chosen to focus on three key developments that it helped to facilitate. The first of these developments is the rapid rise of collecting culture in Britain. So collecting antiquities was already popular among Europeans, and particularly the Italians and the elite Italians, the papacy, aristocratic families, etc., as displaying collections of antiquities in the home was a way to enhance one's social status. It was the fastest way. In the 18th century, as Daisy mentioned just previously there, the excursion known as the Grand Tour became extremely popular among the British. This was a period of travel undertaken by often young aristocratic men as they finished up their education, where they travel around Europe and experience the sights, the sounds, the smells, and buy up Greco-Roman antiquities to take home, also as status-enhancing souvenirs. But of course, you know, the older generation, as it became popular and people became more interested in antiquarianism and archaeology, they started doing that too. And the reason I've included this this painting here by Giovanni Paolo Panini is because I think it really highlights the fixation on antiquity at the time. I don't know if you can see my mouse wiggling around here, but we've got the Colosseum in a painting there, and then below that we've got the Pantheon, and then we've got some very famous sculptures sort of included here as well, like the Farnese Heracles there. Yeah, and so just so we're not in any doubt, I've also included some portraits of the kinds of people who were going off on these tours. So we've got Francis Bassett there, and a portrait of a young man there. These portraits were done in Rome actually by Pompeo Bertoni, and seem to be a kind of like a souvenir portrait type situation, which I think is really interesting and fun. But again, it just shows what was happening with these antiquities. They were sort of being used as status enhancing pieces in people's self-promotion. It's also, I should note, when big name British collectors such as Charles Townley, Richard Payne Knight and William Hamilton began putting together their collections, some of which would later become the sculpture gallery at the British Museum. So this brings me on to the second key development of this period. So while all of this is going on, the field of science, and with it the pursuit of documentation of natural history, is really beginning to flourish. This led to a keen interest in sorting humans into definable categories, which in turn paved the way for what we would now call race science. The roots of this phenomenon can be found as far back as the 16th century and seems to have particular interest to scholars in France. For example, in 1618, Parisian anatomist Jean Riolan the Younger attempted an experiment on a living black man. He intentionally blistered his skin before cutting away the burned area to examine where the blackness ended. And then in 1684, we have Francois Bernier publishing his essay, New Division of the Earth, which claimed that there was a scientific way to classify humans according to physical characteristics. And all of these could be sorted into 4 or 5 species or races of men. By the 18th and 19th centuries, human categorization is a popular branch of philosophical and anatomical studies. And while there were many different theories, the unifying elements of this branch of research were nearly always the same. Light Europeanness was superior, attractive and valued. Foreign darkness was considered savage and closer to animal, as demonstrated in this illustration here by the slightly later Knott and Glidden. So we've got, you know, Europeans, Greek Apollo Belvedere at the top, chimpanzees at the bottom, black people, black Africans in between. Indeed, white Europeanness became strongly linked to the Apollo Belvedere himself, who, thanks in no small part to the work of art historian Johann Joachim Winkelmann, was widely considered to be the definition of idealized beauty at the time. And there he is, looking gorgeous. Sculpture casts perhaps unwittingly helped to perpetuate this idea of physical whiteness being synonymous with the classical world and ideas of classical beauty. So these are some examples I have here from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the majority of which are 18th and 19th century casts of Greek and Roman originals. For the sake of uniformity and to match the marble originals, these pieces were never painted, with the single notable exception of the cast of the Prima Porta Augustus, which we saw before. Here, he's shown here with hair color and eye color, but without the addition of skin color, which leaves him looking a bit spooky and a bit sort of unnaturally pale, which I think will be an interesting thing to explore later in my research. So that brings us to our third key development, which is, of course, the expansion of the British Empire, which had a huge impact on the art and architecture of Britain at the time. So in the later 18th and 19th centuries, we begin to see a real anxiety about Britain's ability to hold on to its conquered territories, which is in no small part due to Britain's loss of the American War for Independence at the end of the 18th century. I'd like to note that this wasn't unique to Britain at the time or over this sort of century. France had recently gone through the seismic upheaval of the French Revolution. Napoleon had styled himself as Emperor of France. And then after his fall, the German Confederation was formed out of all, I think it's 39 or so states there. So what this means is that nations and identities are shifting, some of them quite aggressively, and so too were ideas of what it meant to be part of them. So it's interesting then that it's at this point that we begin to see the rise of neoclassicism, which is a cultural and aesthetic movement inspired by the art and the architecture of the Greco-Roman world. It represented a conspicuous return to what they understood to be the trappings of antiquity. So order, calmness, simplicity, and stripped back austerity almost, was as opposed to the lavish Rococo style that had been popular before, which was arguably a cultural pushback against the political chaos of the late 18th century. And just because I've been quite desperate to get a local example in, this is Grey Street in Newcastle upon Tyne, well-loved Grey Street, with the Theatre Royal on the right there and Grey's Monument at the top, which from this perspective gives us a real kind of large Roman forum look when it is in fact, 19th century Newcastle, which is great. And I just want to highlight here that I don't want to imply that sort of every European collector, or indeed any European collector of Greco-Roman antiquities at this time, was actively thinking, that's great, those ones are white, that's a white guy, I'll take those back, we'll put the rest into storage, because I don't think that's what was happening at all. But rather what was happening was this was a time in which classical imagery was really becoming entrenched in Europe's visual language of power, particularly of moral virtue and nation as well. The result of which led to a preoccupation with monumental white statuary and classicizing art and architecture. This is also when we begin to see white European identities pitted against foreign savages and barbarians to further elevate themselves, really, for which the imagery of classical antiquity was frequently used. I've included a few quick examples here. So we've got classical aesthetics and mythology working together here with the figure of Britannia on the left in an elevated triumphant position over the conquered East, with Hermes over there at the right-hand side, who is the god of trade and commerce, among other things, legitimizing what quite obviously was not trade and commerce, but the results of conquest. And we also have a later example, a 20th century example of a painting that was given to the Foreign Office following British victory in World War I, with Britannia in the middle, sort of welcoming, but also, presiding over other nations coming in, still using the same classical imagery to communicate British conquest. So that's sort of the context, the complicated background, but this is where my research comes in. So what I'm doing is compiling as much data as I can from examples of Black Africans in Greco-Roman galleries. So where did these pieces come from? When did the museums acquire them? How were they displayed? How are they displayed now? And what is their inclusion in broader exhibitions intended to convey? So why are they sometimes taken out of their home, the British Museum, and included in other exhibitions elsewhere? I'm looking at the extent to which they're intentionally othered or used as an exotic counterpoint to whiteness. But most importantly, I'm trying to find out whether galleries and exhibitions' relationships with Black Africans has changed over the years and to the degree to which it's evolved. At present, I'm in the most time-consuming but arguably most rewarding sense of my research, which is the part where I trawl through museum catalogue after museum catalogue to build a solid database. And I'm going to just quickly run through a case study, which will be the British Museum. And I've chosen the British Museum for my first case study as in 1753, it became the world's first example of a national public museum. This is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it contains the collections of some of the most prominent antiquarians at the time, such as Hans Sloane, Charles Townley, William Hamilton, among others. And secondly, and I would argue more importantly, because it was one of the first institutions to inform the public of the kind of art and archaeology deemed worth collecting and worth presenting. With the help of Victoria Donnellan, who's the catalogue manager at the British Museum, I've been able to identify around 50 images of Black Africans in the Greek and Roman department using their online catalogue. This is just a quick rundown of what the process looks like for me. And there's 2 points here which I would like to highlight as potentially where there's a little bit of friction in my work. The first one is, it's the point number 1, which is specify criteria for identifying a figure as of Black African descent, because this relies on stereotyping, which is something I'm looking to query with my work. So it's almost gone full circle in a sense. But I'm hoping that in continuing my research, I'll be able to sort of unravel that and see when this stereotyping began and see if there's anything interesting that can come from that. And then we've got, using the database, finding the pieces, recording as much information as I can from these pieces. My database currently has about 26 different columns, so 26 different pieces of information that I'm looking for from each piece, which is where the time-consuming part comes in. And then number 5 actually is a bit that I would like to talk about a little bit, which is record the language used to describe the pieces in the online catalogues today and in the collections today, which I will move on to in a moment. So in beginning this work during the COVID lockdowns, I've become closely acquainted with their digital database. I haven't actually been there in person yet, but I'm hoping to do that this summer, which has itself raised some interesting questions about databases and cataloguing these collections themselves. I'd like to share some of my more difficult entries so far and show you what I mean by that. So here we have a write-on. This is from the British Museum. I find this one particularly interesting because it's one of the clear entry hangovers from what I imagine was the original record. As you can see here, the description that is on the website, you can go and read it now, is this cup is supported by a molded group representing an African struggling with a crocodile. The Negro has fallen on his right knee. Obviously, we don't use terms like the Negro anymore, but it's still there. It's still part of the catalogue. This is admittedly, it's the only example from the British Museum where this language is used. However, at the Metropolitan Museum, which I've also been looking at to build my database, this pops up again, with other choice phrases such as the black, which, was a little bit surprising because I almost, I understood what was happening at the British Museum because of funding and because of time constraints and because of how difficult it is to really dedicate as much time as you would want to these sort of things. But I was surprised about the American Museum, but that is perhaps because I was a little bit spoiled by the Getty, who is a younger and potentially better funded museum. But their catalogue, where they refer to images of Black Africans, it's Black Africans across the board. There is no strange terminology or archaic phrases. It's a really up-to-date and really, I would argue, probably like a model example of what these should look like. However, I would like to say my communication with Vicky Donnellan at the British Museum means I do know that they are aware of this. It is something they're looking to work on in the future. But I just think what is interesting and what's a little bit disappointing is the fact that it's taken until 2021 for it to become talked about publicly and for it to be sort of really acknowledged, which is what I hope work like mine can just help with, really. So next we have the head of a boy, who I find interesting because there's just so little to go on, and yet he's been used in 2013 as part of an example, as part of an exhibition called Origins of the Afro Comb. So the tight curls of his hair could potentially represent, you know, the kinky texture of Afro hair. But this idealized, very Egyptian face gives us no other features to work with that are representative of any kind of sort of ethnicity, really. The British Museum's database does not mention his ethnicity or give any sort of clues towards that. It doesn't say black, doesn't say African, just says boy. And my question here, which is, you know, these are the pieces that raise questions, is curly hair enough to go on in the process of identifying someone's heritage, and what that might mean for my database and how I approach, you know, the collection of my data. And yeah, at the point I am at in my research, I don't have an answer to that yet, but check back at some point. So I think this is, yes, the final piece that I would like to talk about a little bit is this head of a woman, discovered in Tunisia and used in a couple of exhibitions about the breadth of the Roman Empire. So this on the British Museum's website is described as a Parian marble portrait of an African woman with her hair arranged in corkscrew curls. And what I really like about this one is that this hairstyle that you're seeing here is absolutely representative of Black African heritage. We see it, I've seen it a lot on the images that I do have. My database is currently 80 pieces at the moment, and it's a visual identifier of Black Africans that I've documented. However, I was actually preparing for a presentation for my supervisors when I noticed that, and I hope that you'll be able to see it. I know that this black and white photography is really frustrating, but if you can see here at her hairline, there are some little wiggly waves there, which reveals that this is actually a wig being worn on top of a straighter, you know, wavy but not corkscrew curl, not Afro hairstyle. So that was really interesting because should this change the way that we understand her ethnicity? Or should it not? I mean, you can be an African and have loose hair, especially if you're a North African. But what does that mean for how we then continue to label this woman going forwards? And how has she been described as, how has she been, you know, decided to be an African? We don't really have that visual marker anymore because the hair is in fact a wig. But more sort of positively, what could it potentially tell us about people's relationship with other ethnicities, or even their own ethnicities, depending, and cultures? You know, like how were people interacting with that in the ancient world? So to conclude, like I said, I'm going to sort of bring this back to the question that I raised for this talk, which was, why does invoking the classical world still conjure imagery of both racialized and artistic whiteness? And as I think the first part of my presentation sort of highlighted, is because that's how the art of classical antiquity has been used for the last 250 years at least, and little has been done by our museums to redress that, or little has been able to be done so far. Through my research, I found that artworks depicting Black Africans were included in the collections of antiquities that founded the British Museum's sculpture gallery, particularly the Townley collection. If memory serves, that's where one of the images of the sculpture of the Black acrobat that I showed was from. and that these images span from caricature to beautiful realistic representations such as this Hellenistic vessel here. However, these pieces have spent years being systematically sidelined in favour of monumental white marble sculpture. And I would argue that this is in no small part because representations of Black Africans have never been perceived as holding the same value as their white counterparts in collections, and that they still don't, as Europe and America continue to enshrine Western civilization in the art and architecture of antiquity. To end on a hopeful note, though, Black Africans are beginning to be reconsidered in the fields of classics and classical archaeology, and there's so much great work happening from my peers in universities all over, really sort of digging into this subject and thinking about how we look back at collections and race and ethnicity within that. And it's my hope that continued research will help us reassess the power structures that decided which kinds of antiquities do and don't have value. And from there, we'll all gain a better understanding of our shared history. And my final slide, in case anyone is interested, is just some suggested reading that I found particularly illuminating around these subjects. And that's, thank you for listening.